What is the original survival horror game? This question is a surprisingly debatable topic. Depending on where you look, you may find different games are thrown out as the potential first for the genre. In some circles, I've seen claims that it's Haunted House, a game released in 1982 for the Atari 2600. Oftentimes, a 1989 NES title called Sweet Home will be suggested as well. This project was directed by Takara Fujiwara, who would later go on to make Resident Evil, the series that first coined the term survival horror. With respect, neither one of these retro games are deserving of the mantle. There was one title that predates both Haunted House and Sweet Home, and I'd argue was equally foundational to the design of the genre. In 1980, arcades around the world were inundated with a game the Japanese call Paku Paku, but in the West we knew Paku Paku under a different name. I'd argue that Pac-Man is the true pioneer of the survival horror video game. I'm not the only person to have come to this conclusion. In John Romero's autobiography, Doom Guy: Life in First Person, he spends a whole chapter espousing his love for the arcade classic. At one point, the famous game designer describes Pac-Man as being revolutionary for its, quote, survival approach to gameplay. There are also Reddit threads and entire articles dedicated to this topic already, even a Pac-Man-inspired horror game to further sell my position. This isn't exactly a new idea. It's important to define terms, however, so that begs the question, what constitutes a survival horror game? The Federalist article, 6 Elements That Make for a Quality Survival Horror Game, is a pretty succinct way to cover this question. The piece makes the case that the genre requires disempowerment, isolation, tension, uncertainty, lingering fear, and an imbalanced or weak protagonist. It seems to me that at a foundational level, Pac-Man fills all of those criteria with flying colors. The yellow ball has very little means of fighting off the ghosts, no help from others to do so, you're constantly worried about the ghosts following you, or coming back after you eat them, and you die instantly if they touch you. The enemies are also ghosts, if the intent wasn't obvious enough. Boom! Why is it that we've all played Pac-Man, but very few people even think of it as a horror game? The answer is pretty simple, actually. It's presentation. Consider the gameplay loop of the genre. You play as a character trapped in a dark, maze-like dungeon you're trying to escape. All the while, creatures are relentlessly hunting you down, begging to kill you. At your disposal are limited resources, some of which are required to progress, and others to defend against the monsters. While I actually just described Resident Evil 2, Pac-Man perfectly applies as well. The reason you may not see it that way boils down to the presentation of these seemingly opposing experiences. Earlier I mentioned a Pac-Man-inspired horror game. While I'm sure there are a number of them out there somewhere, I was more deliberately thinking of a game called The Hall. It's basically the same exact premise, but with 2 slight twists. Number 1 being, you play in first person. Your character goes around collecting orbs, much like Pac-Man, and collecting all of the orbs opens the maze so you can escape. Sounds familiar. The other twist, in a stroke of irony, has the player running from a giant, grotesque, and terrifying version of Pac-Man himself. The Hall loses the endless and iconic Waka Waka sound, chiptune music, and bright colors, instead opting to put you into the action by shifting perspectives. Otherwise, Pac-Man and The Hall are effectively the same game. All that truly changes at a foundational level is how the experience is presented. The original rendition of this idea, having been released in 1980, is simply quaint by modern standards. It's difficult to mentally shift that viewpoint of the simple and bright presentation into something we view as scary. An obvious comparison to this idea would be like pointing out that Elden Ring is the modern logical conclusion to the original Legend of Zelda. From a presentational standpoint, they're nothing alike, but when you break down the foundations of the game design, the comparison would be obvious to most. I think omitting Pac-Man out of this designation is a product of early growing pains. It stems from simply not having the terminology at the time. After all, if I'm claiming it's the first survival horror game, it would seem that the public didn't even have that phrase in mind until over a decade later. Ask yourself, if you changed the music to something a little more ominous, and the ghosts made a scary noise when they got near Pac-Man or something, would you feel differently about the experience? One of gaming's most important game designers says Pac-Man was revolutionary for its, quote, survival gameplay. So we obviously understood the undertones of survival horror that are there, even without the terminology back in the day. Doesn't that say something? The arcade classic also fits every standard modern criteria for the genre, and in some ways clearly fills the criteria more than a few Resident Evil entries. Why shouldn't we consider Pac-Man the original survival horror game?